from Pontes Books, here with the fun fact for the conclusion of The Prince and the Pauper. This is our final video to go with The Prince and the Pauper. This is it. This is the end. Hopefully then we'll move on to something else, but there might be just a little bit of a break until our next book comes out, which you'll have more information about soon. So the fun fact for the conclusion is another one that's kind of relevant to modern day, another legal one. So a couple videos ago, we talked about something that had to do, a ward, the King's Ward, somewhat recently in our videos, talking about how that is a legal, term that is used. This is a similar fun fact that it does have to do with the law, kind of in a modern day context. So the one that we're looking at today is lying under duress, because that's something that happens. Really, I'm looking at committing a crime under duress, but lying under duress is specifically what happens in the story, not so much the crime. So the place that we see this in The Prince and the Pauper, in the conclusion, is kind of when we get an explanation for why Lady Edith acted the way that she did. So it is as follows. When the mysteries were all cleared up, it came out by confession of Hugh Hendon that his wife had repudiated Miles by his command that day at Hendon Hall, a command assisted and supported by the perfectly trustworthy promise that if she did not deny that he was Miles Hendon and stand firmly to it, he would have her life, whereupon she said, "Take it." She did not value it, and she would not repudiate Miles. Then the husband said he would spare her life, but have Miles assassinated. This was a different matter, so she gave her word and kept it. So basically what that all means here is that when Lady Edith denied knowing Miles Hendon and claimed that she did not know him, didn't recognize him, that was because she was under duress, which we'll talk about here. And that means that she was being threatened, basically, and she feared for her own life and someone else's life. There's kind of both. As an example here, as you can see, she didn't really fear for her own life, but as soon as it switched to Miles is when she started to obey what Hugh had to say. So what is duress? The act of using threats or psychological pressure to force someone to behave in a way that is contrary to their wishes. So that is clearly something that's happening here. She was being threatened and had some psychological pressure to force her to behave in a certain way that she didn't want to behave. So it could include using force. So in this case, he didn't even really have to use any force. It was all about the threat. So, but it could be force, false imprisonment, coercion, threats, or psychological pressure. And duress can be physical or it can be economic. So we'll talk a little bit more about economic duress a little bit later, but hers is more physical. There's a physical threat that's being threatened to Miles. So there are some requirements for something to be considered in the legal sense, duress, and that is where her argument kind of stops, because you'll see she maybe doesn't meet these full requirements. However, I think it still falls under this category. So step one, the party is in immediate threat of serious bodily harm or death. So I don't know how immediate it is necessarily. There's not a weapon that we know of, being held up to her at the time. But it is, the near future, I guess. Step two, the party believes that the perpetrator will carry out the threat. I think that is absolutely true. I think she does believe that Hugh would follow through on whatever threat he made. And step three, there is no opportunity to escape safely except by committing the unlawful act. So this is another one that I think maybe there could be some holes in her argument if she was using this. She didn't really have anywhere else to go, but there wasn't anything that was technically stopping her from, escaping, except for fear that maybe he'd find her, and, also, again, not having anywhere to go. So those are kind of the legal requirements. So then I just wanted to look a little bit the difference between duress and necessity. So we see necessity here a little bit because of a slight difference in the way that Hugh changes his tactics when she refuses to, I guess, obey him at first. So necessity defense, again, in the legal sense, involves committing illegal acts in order to prevent the threat of harm to another person, as opposed to duress is committing an illegal act or doing something in order to prevent the threat of harm to yourself. So in this case, because he switches from, oh, I'm going to hurt you, and she's like, I don't care, hurt me, then he's like, oh, I'm going to hurt Miles, it might fall more under this category of necessity. But even still, you know, it's gray area. So here's an example. So necessity can also be used in court. And so here's an example of kind of the differences. So these are modern examples. Duress would be an accountant being forced to sign a document authorizing a legal transfer of funds at gunpoint. Okay, he has an immediate threat to his own life. If he doesn't do this illegal act, he's going to die, right? So he can use that as a defense that his life was in immediate danger. Example of necessity could be a night nurse who is forced to break into a pharmacy to get life-saving drugs for a patient who is dying. So the pharmacy wasn't open. She doesn't have the, I guess, license to be able to do that. Technically, that is a crime for her to do that, but she had to do it in order to save someone's life. So those are, like I said, modern day examples. And this example may or may not fit into it, but really Edith didn't commit a crime, so she wouldn't ever have to like go and defend herself in court. It's really just defending herself to Miles why she acted the way that she did. So how can duress be used as a legal defense? So it doesn't justify committing a crime, but it can be used as an excuse. And so then if they are using this defense, the defense has to prove that a reasonable person in the defendant's position would have also committed the crime if they were in that same spot. So that's their task. And it is not typically used as a defense to murder, but sometimes then the charge, could be lowered to reduced to manslaughter if this is a part of the defense, but it's not, doesn't usually ever let anyone get away with murder entirely, unless maybe it's just like a really extreme circumstance or something like that. So just a couple other facts to wrap up the conversation about duress. If a person is acting under duress, they're not acting of their own free will. So that is kind of where the trickiness comes in, is where, yeah, they committed a crime, but if they are not acting of their own free will, are they really guilty of that crime? So that's the task of the attorneys to argue in defense of the person who committed whatever act. And then this is the part I kind of mentioned previously, that it could be economic as well. So if an individual or business is under financial duress, they may lack good solutions to money problems, which could lead to crimes, because they could be acting out of desperation in order to save, themselves financially or their business financially. So, it could be caused on the individual level by someone losing their job or a foreclosure on their home, experiencing a health crisis, kind of some of those unexpected events that come up that affect people financially, sometimes leads people to commit certain crimes under economic duress. So that was an interesting one to add in there as well. That's a little bit of information about duress, and that is a wrap on The Prince and the Pauper. Hopefully you learned something over this whole stretch of 33 plus 1 chapter, 33 chapters and the conclusion. Have a good rest of your day.